I don't like Valhalla. I don't like trouble. Today I will speak about why, in my opinion, the woke movement is under attack currently. But first I need to tell you something, and that is, people say that it's so complicated to diagnose cluster B personality disorder. But I think in the future we will be able to just do a brain scan, an fMRI scan, that will already give clues, because the amygdala and the neocortex and mirror neurons will show significant difference in psychopathic people and healthy people. Artificial intelligences will be capable of recognizing these patterns and also can help when fed with video material of a person in a social interaction, using eye tracking and analyzing facial gestures, facial muscular actions. How is the person smiling? What are the voice and semantic patterns they use? What is the body language? Yeah, I mentioned eye tracking. So in other words, both behavioral, physical, analyzing the language, analyzing the brain, it will be easy to get a clue about the person without going into a complicated diagnosis procedure. Yes, so I also want to mention once again that the brain that we have as human beings is quite new and still buggy and has some hiccups. You know, to live, to just live daily life, the reptile brain and the old brain parts are enough. In other words, not every human being by far is using the whole potential of the brain. So the neocortex is one of the newer parts of the brain and is necessary for social advanced functions. But it's not necessary for narcissistic or psychopathic abuse. So, in other words, it's still questionable whether the higher complexity is a good adaptation or not. Okay, so because in this case, simplicity, aka the reptile brain, can beat the more complex brain in the short term at least. Anyway, that being said, why is the woke movement, and by the way, I am even not allowed to say this word anymore, so I will not use it again, because language is violence. And everybody is allowed to suffer, of course. And we need safe spaces for victimized people. I agree 100% with that. By the way, I made another post where I claim you need to subscribe and check out my community section. I have not released it yet, but it's in preparation. I claim that people who act based on entitlement and self-absorption, making differences in people based on their origin or genders or archetypal patterns. So it can be that a person has the gender of a man, but the archetypal behavior of femininity, as well as you can have a person with the gender of a woman embodying masculine traits. But anybody who makes differences based on that is a sexist. So everybody who makes differences based on entitlement and self-absorbed thinking, making differences on people based on their origin or or place of birth or skin color or gender or whatever, this is racistic and sexistic. But if you act based on entitlement and self-absorption and engage in a movement of fighting racism by inverting it, or fighting sexism by inverting it, you are also a racist or a sexist. In other words, the only way to overcome this is to start on an individual level. You are the only person you have real influence on. Therefore, if you don't make differences amongst people based on their country of origin or their skin color or their gender or the archetype they represent, you treat them as equal persons, it's the only way to be not racistic or sexistic, in my opinion. Now let's get to the point. The problem with the woke... Oh, I said a word. Excuse me for my violent assault. The problem with a victimhood movement, with some victim... a movement of victims that is aiming for liberation, I would support it. But a movement that is undermined by people using victimhood mentality to exercise force on unsuspecting functional people, I would not support it. And I believe what happened in some of these movements was that the patterns have been reversed. In other words, there were people who are functional and have no identity problem or confusion. So they are functional in their job, in their work. They contribute to society in one form or the other. They are also functional in social structures, which means they are not abusive. They don't create new traumatized victims. And they know who they are and are not engaging in any competition about hierarchy or identity. In other words, healthy people with no problem. If we protect minorities, we also need to protect the majority that is generating and running society. And when we have the tendency that people with identity confusions and problems or traumatic experiences, subjective traumatic experiences, make people without trauma problems, functional people with no identity confusion and so on, if they transfer it to them, we have a problem. If victims make all society suffer, this is a problem. Because if the suffering of victimized groups becomes the suffering of everyone, there is the one problem that the people who provide the resources and the stability to make these safe spaces possible and the support for these groups, so they already invest for it. They pay this in form of taxes. They create the space for that. They voted the parties that made this possible. So in a democracy, this is what the majority wanted. And if now if this majority then starts to suffer from the minority, it creates frustration and confusion, because let's say there is a person that is functioning and having no identity problem, and then gets replaced through a forceful attempt to integrate a person that has an identity problem or a dysfunction. Now, if this person is forcefully integrated into a space and replacing a functioning person with no identity problem, then what we see is a switch on a political, it's kind of a political level. It's an identity switch on a political level. So in order to push through a political agenda of forceful integration of dysfunctional people, we create a transfer of an identity problem and a confusion onto functional people who were not confused before. And this is an essential problem, because we started out with a society that had a functional and non-confused, healthy, just functioning part, and a dysfunctional, victimized part. And then we kind of pay the price of attacking the healthy, or we risk the health of the functioning part of society in order to fulfill a political ideology that is going mayhem, something like that. Yeah, so we can't make this kind of identity switch happen, that suddenly people have to suffer who had no problem before, and make it possible to help people with problems and let them personally pay for that in their daily life, and put so many resources to create a forcefully an integration of each and every one, whether violent or problematic or traumatized or having all kinds of psychotic or narcissistic self-concepts into society. This comes with a high price in the healthy and not confused. It creates new victims that were not victims before. So all I'm saying is, if we protect minorities and try to integrate them and try to support them, of course we also need to protect the healthy and not problematic part of society that makes it possible to help these minorities. And also we need to understand that what we see in racism and sexism are symptoms of a sick society, and it is not solved by inverting it into another form of racism or sexism. We need to fight the symptoms, and this is only possible if we overcome it on an individual level, which means an individual needs to stop making differences based on this. It's the only way. Otherwise, it just goes back and forth, and there is always people who make these differences on both sides. So it's a rhythm of inflation and deflation. People who are oppressed based on sex or race feel that they get deflated. They get oppressed and deflated. And then they get this safe space, and then they inflate themselves, stand up, which is all right and fine. But when they then create a new form of oppressing, of revenge on those who they suspect to have been these abusers, and in reality, people who were not engaging in this at all, who were not part of this, start to suffer from it, we have a new form of racism or sexism, okay? So therefore, we don't need a deflation or an inflation, we need a balance. And we're living in a highly polarized society, a highly sensitive, a hypersensitive society. Everybody is suffering, everybody is hypersensitive, HSP, everybody is a victim, everybody is, what we need is a balance. We don't need a far right politics, we don't need a far left politics, we don't need super feminine politics, we don't need hyper masculine politics. We need a healthy balance of all of this, but this is far away, it's nowhere to be seen. And for this reason that we are kind of inflamed in a hypersensitive state, nervous, anxious, extreme, going between these extremes of far left, far right, there is no middle ground. And therefore we make these radical changes in politics and in society. We have lost the healthy consensus of what is healthy. We are living in a highly polarized world that goes back and forth between extremes instead of being grounded in a real equal idea of genders, identities, and of course, I wonder why racism still exists. For me, I don't make differences based on this, on where somebody is born or his color. Where if I make a difference, it's based on functioning in social life, in society, in economic life. This is, in my opinion, much more goal-oriented and solution-oriented. If we look who is functioning and contributing, why shouldn't we support those and create safe spaces for others, but not enable them to revenge on those who don't have a problem? Yeah, just another thought that I'm currently having.